Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very, very delighted to have Mr. Gene Ho with me today. He is the author of Trumpography, which I will link in the bottom for all of you to check out. And he was actually President Trump's, or then Mr. Trump's, personal campaign photographer. So really, really excited to have Gene with us today. Gene, how have you been doing?
I've been doing wonderful, and it's great. And thank you very much for having me on your show.
Absolutely. I'm so glad your publicist, Paul, reached out. I was obviously very honored. And I'll be honest, like when he kind of linked me to you, I had seen your name before, but I didn't really like go full force. And I was like, oh, it's the same guy who was talking about, being his campaign photographer and finding out a side of Mr. Trump that not many of us actually get to experience, not even his own family, from what you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, and it was a great experience. I spent about 2 years with Trump, so probably about 3 or 4 months before he even officially ran for president, and until the very last day of the campaign. So it was the whole time, and it was neat because I got to see a different perspective, spend hours with him, but I'm not always having a conversation with him. I'm just kind of watching him and observing him and taking pictures for him, of course.
Right, and there was one thing that you had mentioned earlier, not just in other interviews, but in your book about Trump's character as how it pertains to how he's presented. So I know you mentioned he was a tough boss.
Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Well, here's the thing. In the book, I talk about a time when basically I broke protocol. There's certain things that you have to do, and it's an easy job per se, but it's very stressful because I did a lot of the VIP lines. So Trump is standing there, and I ask the next person to come by and shoot him, next person, and take pictures of him. But I mean, there are times that I either didn't do it fast enough, or maybe sometimes my photography color balance wasn't right, or something wasn't right, because we're going in backstage, and every situation is different. So there was times that he says, "Well, I don't like it this," or he likes this, or doesn't like that. But the best thing about Trump is he knows how to be a boss. He knows how to be a leader. But at the same time, he knows how to turn it off. Like when I introduced him to my family, he didn't start talking about all the mistakes that I made backstage or whatever. He was able to just turn that off and really be charming in front of my family, talked about how wonderful I was doing with the campaign. And it just made me feel good, and it just made me understand that you have a person that can get the job done and could push you, which we want a tough boss. But is also personal to you. And I like the guy. I really do. And I don't have to say that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And from what I can tell, obviously he's the president now, but it sounds like he is very, very, especially for people who he's worked with, or who is, who have worked under him. It seems like he fosters a little bit more of a personal relationship, especially after that initial barrier has been met. Like, I feel like, from what I can tell with interviews with President Trump, he can remember people's names. He can remember people from, who he worked with years ago, and if they did a good job or not, because clearly, the way he'll talk about you is in a very personalized way. It's not, what I'm trying to say is he doesn't strike me as a very generic character, even though.
No, someone, the people that do know him, for example, Diamond and Silk, that know him, and I feel the same way about it. Donald Trump has a very unique quality that if he's talking with you, he's looking right at you and he's undistracted, which is an interesting quality, because I know, and I'm guilty of this myself, that if I'm at a big event and I'm talking to someone, and I hate this is like the worst trait I hate about myself. Deep inside, my mind's wandering and my mind's spotting someone else that might be more prominent or more important than the person I'm talking with. And I hate that. But Trump doesn't do that. If you're talking with Trump, he will look at you and he will converse with you, and it's like no one else is in the room except for you and him. And it's a wonderful attribute that I would love to have, and I'm working on.
That's really interesting, but also doesn't surprise me to hear. For someone like that to actually give you the time of day, being the businessman that he is, or at the time was. I can only imagine that you have a million things on his plate. And it wasn't until recently, Gene, I made a video about Trump's border wall deal, right? It was relating it to aspects of his book, The Art of the Deal. And in the first couple of chapters of that book, he outlines his daily schedule. And there's a lot of check-ins. There's probably more meetings than there are executions. But what I appreciated the most was the level of detail as to describing the interactions, making sure he was reinforcing his managers for the good right behavior, correcting things as needed. And that's why what you're telling me now actually makes a lot of sense, right?
It's actually funny that you should mention that, because my very first conversation with Trump, or actually long conversation, was basically on one of his books, because he did the generic, I was a fan of his even before this, and I did this thing where, hey, Mr. Trump, read all your books, I love them. And I don't know if he was setting me up, but he goes, I bet Art of the Deal was your favorite book. I said, no. I said, Mr. Trump, actually my favorite book is Art of the Comeback. And it was interesting because then I don't know if he was testing me or whatever, but I started telling him about a situation in that book where Trump talked about attention to detail, where he was able to look at a building and he could just tell that it was a little bit off. And I've always kept that within me with my photography, that I can look at it and it may be perfect for everyone else, but with my photography, like, I want all the details right there. And it was interesting you mentioned attention to detail.
Yeah. I think that I was aware of Trump before he was obviously a politician. Weirdly enough, this is actually going to segue really nicely into my next question that you'll have a lot of insight about. But my father was a big Rich Dad, Poor Dad guy. So he read a lot of Kiyosaki books. I recall there was a lot of like personal finance books and business books that were around the house when I was growing up. And, Robert Kiyosaki was a big one, but Robert Kiyosaki also co-wrote many books with President Trump. And it's funny because, like, this was years before politics. This was like 2004, 2005 when I was a kid. My dad actually had like a Donald Trump game, but it was like he knew how to make deals and all of that. And it was weird because I knew of Donald Trump a long time ago, but the way I saw him as a kid was not the way I see him now, because he's obviously the president, he's our politician now, but there was a lot of inherent knowledge and inner workings of like personal finance and business stuff that weirdly enough was in my childhood that my parents were taking from. So that's the thing. Like, Trump, when I was growing up, was not spoken of as like necessarily a politician or somebody who has quick wit or being a New Yorker. Like, the way my dad describes Donald Trump is like, he's just a New Yorker. When he talks and he says these things, that's how New Yorkers talk. They're kind of direct. They don't really hold back. And he's a boomer. Like, he's from that generation of, like, have you ever heard, like, a 70-year-old Jewish person from Brooklyn? Like, that's how they talk. That's just how they talk. Like, and that's funny because my father lived in New York for many years, and he keeps telling me that. And that's why when he describes Trump, he describes him as just like, oh, he's just a guy.
I think that's what really appealed to everyone. And the people that he actually meets in person, I'll be honest, when I first met Trump, I've always been a fan of his. But when I first met him, I really thought for a second that, this guy might be the biggest jerk in the world, because I met a lot of celebrities, a lot of them which I won't name, but I met a lot of celebrities I just adored and loved. And then you meet them in real life, and then you're like, man, this guy's a jerk. So I went in there thinking that maybe that would happen with Trump, but the people that know him, that actually spend time with him, will tell you he is a charming man. Yes, I get it, because I see the side of him which he needs to be as either our commander-in-chief, or even before that, my boss as in the campaign. He's a tough man. He expects things to get done and expects it done right. But at the same time, he is extremely charming. He's a wonderful man.
Why do you think Trump is attacked as much as he is?
That's an interesting question, but I think it has to do more with the agenda of what he wants done. I think he is perhaps the most dangerous man alive, in the sense that he says, this is how it needs to be, and I'm going to complete it this way. And everything he says he's going to do, Donald Trump gets it done sooner or later. And I think it scares people, and then it removes other people basically from power, that they're just afraid of him in that way. And that's what I believe.
Do you think that Trump's victory, despite all the great things that he was celebrated for, not only as a businessman but as a person of good character, of good value, good virtue, Do you think that his victory had more to do with the fact that it just wasn't what people were expecting, which is why they attack him as much as he did, or actually for what he stands for? You see, because I think that now we've seen 2 years of Trump where people kind of get conflated a little bit between what he stands for and represents and the victory that was stolen from the left. And I think that that's the two things that I start to see that divides people more so than anything. Because you talk about policies to people who are leftists and they can't name a single thing. And that's usually
Right.
what gets interesting.
Well, it was like this. I remember the last day. I remember election night. I finished my last rally. Finished taking pictures of Trump that day, and I went home. And my dad called me. He goes, "Son, how do you think he's going to do?" I said, "I know he's going to win." And my dad said, "No, no way. He's never going to win because he's never going to win Florida." I said, "Dad, you have no idea what's really going on in America." When I was on the campaign trail, I would talk to so many people that would say, "You know what? I can't tell my family, but I'm secretly voting for Trump." That's why they called us, or me, the silent majority. I mean, even back then, and I voted for Trump. I supported him. I endorsed him for president, and it had nothing to do with me working on his campaign. I just knew that he was a person for the job.
Yeah.
But there was a time that we were so scared to be, number one, Christians, so scared to say, hey, maybe we could be a little more selfish now as a country and get ourselves right first. And, you know, we're not closing off the border forever or something like that. What we're really doing is we're just making so that it's not an open border. And I think people deep inside feel the same way as Trump. But for a while there, before the election, people were afraid. And that's why they called us the silent majority, because deep inside we felt that way. But me as a business owner, as a photographer, I was wondering if, hey, if I support Trump, you know, how will other people think me? Will they also view me as a racist as they try to peg it on him? And I think that's what happened.